election, he was working in a consulting practice supporting not-for-profit aged care providers. David's got qualifications in industrial relations with 20 years experience working in the labour movement as a training and industrial officer. Diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune condition, David is a long-term therapeutic cannabis consumer and knows firsthand how out-of-date and out-of-touch Victoria's cannabis laws are. He's determined to see cannabis legalised, destigmatised and its many benefits recognised for all Victorian consumers, all adult Victorian consumers. And Rachel was elected to Victorian State Parliament at the 2022 election. She holds a Master's degree in Public Policy and extensive experience working for organisations like Heroes Association, the Family Court of Australia and Centrelink. An advocate for women's rights, equality and inclusivity, Rachel is actively involved in the LGBTIQ+ community and is also an acclaimed performance artist. Rachel believes that cannabis law reform is well overdue. She's keen to drive the conversation around the role of cannabis as a catalyst for new economic opportunities, environmental ingenuity and creation. So David and Rachel are going to be talking about the Victorian Road Safety Amendment that stipulates legal prescribed cannabis is not captured by drug driving laws. Both the Victorian government and opposition are backing legalised cannabis effort to change unfair road safety laws. So thanks Rachel and David.
Thank you Will for that introduction. I forgot that I put all of that in my bio. It's nice to remind myself how far I've all the stuff that I've done to get here, which is pretty exciting. I guess I'll just kick off by giving you a bit of an update of what the current state of play is with Victoria and the driving laws. We've only been in Parliament since February and we've introduced a private member's bill to get the ball rolling on reform in this space. But I'd also like to acknowledge that Fiona Patten from Reason Party, who was formerly in Parliament before us, has put forward a bill. We've basically put the exact same bill up, just a little bit more fine-tuned. So that conversation, that push has been happening in Victoria for a few years. It's not just sort of in the last few months that this has been a campaign being worked on. But I guess the current state of play with driving laws is we have roadside drug testing, pretty vigilant roadside drug testing in Victoria. And it means that if you get pulled over for a random drug side test, and you test positive for THC, which you would if you're medicinally prescribed for any cannabis products, you don't have any medical defence, even if you're not impaired. And clearly you wouldn't be impaired if you were driving. Those that are impaired, the police can just arrest for impairment, but they very rarely do that. They make an arrest and they suspend your licence instantly based on the fact that you've got presence in your system. So just to give by way of a bit of an update, we introduced this, David read in this private member's bill February? Second day in Parliament. And the response that we received when we brought it forward for debate was the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, most of the crossbench members were very supportive of reform, and some of the key arguments that were being presented was around the fact that any other medicine, you are provided that medical defence. They don't test for opioid-based medicines, they don't test for Valium. We know that most people who consume cannabis medicinally, it's for pain medication. Other forms of pain medication that have higher risk and higher harm profile and probably impair you more so are not tested for. So the issue for us has been that this is discrimination for medicinal cannabis patients. And we know that cannabis stays in your system for a long time. So it's really hard to measure that definitive line of what is impairment, and what we're sort of trying to push for is that all medications should be treated the same. Your doctor will prescribe your medication and explain to you what that medication does, provides warning labels on the medication and gives you an idea of when and where you are safe to drive. So we think that should be a relationship between patient and doctor. We also think that the police have the ability to arrest based on impairment, and if you are impaired, there is no denying you shouldn't be driving. But we know that that's not the case for medicinal cannabis patients. Did you want to go over some of
Sure. Yeah, but I think Rachel's raised the key point here, which is that all we're saying with the medicinal cannabis driving, sorry, I'm still getting into the morning, is that if it's prescribed by a doctor, it's a medicine. And if you're going to assess people who are driving, then you should treat cannabis like any other medicine. It's that simple. That's the touch point. It's not a road safety issue. Okay, if someone's impaired and manifestly impaired, they shouldn't be on the road. So we're not arguing for any change. But just because it's in your system, you shouldn't be treated differently. And in that sense, we have a view that the current laws aren't actually about road safety. They're just one arm of prohibition. Yeah? And I think one of the things that really, if you'll pardon the pun, drives home the point here is that if you look at the stats, and the stats are very hard to get, we actually had to get the Parliamentary Library to get the stats. What it showed was over the last 3 years, there was like a little bit over 13,000 people who were arrested for the presence of THC in their blood.
Microscopic presence.
Any trace element. You've got people who get arrested who are on CBD, but the trace element of THC that's in the CBD they've been using is enough to trigger it. So 13,000 presence charges and 130 impairment charges. So it's not about people driving dangerously, it's about people who are simply using a medicine and getting busted for it, and that is the base point that we're arguing on. We do face a lot of, we absolutely agree with you in principle, but what about the road safety hazard? You know, because we don't want to unleash carnage on the roads, and that's what they sort of keep on throwing back at us. And of course, the fact of the matter is that there's no evidence to support that. In fact, there's been 3 studies released in the last few months from Canada where they've been able to look at the 4 years since legalisation, and surprise, surprise, there's been no increase in accidents in Canada since legalisation. And we're not talking about medicinal cannabis here, we're talking about legalisation. That's like everyone. And I think, you know, I don't know about you, but like, if I have a nice billy, you know, what do I want to do? I want to go out in the car and drive quickly. You know, that's my idea of a really good evening. I mean, it's bullshit. You know, if anything, it's like, whoa, and you can be quite fine, I don't know about you, but I don't want to go driving. And of course, the other real irony is you say in Victoria, medicinal cannabis is legal, but then you say to people, but you can't get in your car to go and pick it up. You know, you have to get the bus. Okay. So there's just all this. It's about prohibition, not road safety, and so we're currently negotiating with the government to set up what will probably be in the first instance a trial to simply prove the point. Because what we need to do is get through this myth that's being perpetuated, which is that if you make medicinally cannabis, if you legalise people who are using medicinally cannabis able to drive, there'll be carnage. So the trial is a way of just proving that that's the bullshit it is. And that's pretty much where we're up to.
When does the trial start?
Oh, we're still in the argy-bargy negotiating with the government, because obviously it'll come down to how restrictive is the trial, how is it assessed, and cutting through some of the propaganda. So we've got academics who are very supportive. We've got other academics who are very close to the police. And so we've got, for example, Monash University saying that roadside drug testing saved over 60 lives per annum. And they base that, that's right, they base that on the fact that when people were killed in accidents, which is obviously regrettable, if there was any trace of THC in their system, and recognised in a coronial setting where they're doing blood testing, a person could have had a joint a month previously. They'll still find trace elements in the blood, and then for Monash University and the Victoria Police, that is a case of someone who died as a result of having cannabis in their blood. They don't do a causative analysis. Yeah? You could have been parked and someone pulls into the back of you, and you still count as a cannabis-induced death. So it's cutting through all of the bullshit that's put up to support the prohibition with some sensible law via a trial, and we're just negotiating that at the moment. How do you evaluate it? How do you prove the point?
Yeah, and I think David raises some interesting points about some of the barriers that we have faced trying to initiate what a trial would look like, and you know, some of the issues are that the police is a huge roadblock for us, and the instance of, pardon my pun, the instance that they put up is always that there is a high presence of there is a high number of people with THC in the system in those stats of people who are dying on the roads. But what and some of the other barriers that they do throw up to us is that current testing is just picking up THC, it's not measuring impairment. So they kind of always do come back to this, well, how do we measure impairment? And we're saying, well, there is ways of doing that. Clearly, if someone's swerving all over the road, they're impaired. Clearly, if they're not looking at you, you know, there's definite ways that they can measure that. And they do that for every other medicated person. They do that when it comes to other painkillers. And those charges of impairment, the 130 figure that David initiated before, is, we're assuming that's impairment for any type of drug or medication. They don't capture impairment just for cannabis. So we don't know exactly how much of that 130 are cannabis related. We also know that there's a lack of training amongst the police about what medicinal cannabis is and how it interacts with people's bodies, but also that people are prescribed. A lot of the pharmacists that we work with and a lot of the medical prescribers we work with tell us that they get calls from the police quite regularly about, oh, I've got this person here, they're saying that they're your patient, and the pharmacist and the doctor is the one who has to explain that yes, it is a medication, they are prescribed, yes, they can even be prescribed flour, yes, it's in a specific container and things like that. So there is a real lack of support within the upper echelons of the police, and there's not enough training that's going through their systems to understand what is going on. But in talking to a lot of police officers, we do get that feedback that they don't want to have to be doing this. They don't want to have to be pulling people over and arresting people when they clearly can see that they're not impaired. If anything, a lot of patients find they're a lot safer as drivers when they are medicated.
That's a sign of impairment too. If you're driving slowly below the speed limit.
That's right. Well, you know, think of some symptoms like Parkinson's or MS, where people do have tremors. Cannabis is alleviating those tremors, thus making them safer. We also get the argument a lot, which is that how can I tell the difference between someone consuming their medicine and socially consuming? Well, you can't. You can't. But what you have to do is give people the benefit of the doubt, and if they are producing a medical certificate, they're not impaired, they're clearly just using their medication. And we know that most people who may be consuming outside of their script is because it's cost prohibitive. It's that they might grow their own, or they might have someone supply them, rather than it's a bit cheaper than, you know, having to buy medicine, which is at a huge expense. So David mentioned earlier that we're sort of working with the Road Safety Minister. It's obviously very complex because there's huge concern about road safety, and we want to make sure that this is done properly. So what we have done is we've proposed some really sensible ideas to take to road safety, to the police, to the Premier, of what a trial might look like and how we can best position ourselves to have a successful trial as well. So I'll just run through with you some of those findings that we found would be most conducive to a successful trial, which was that we know that the conversation has to start at point of prescription. So your doctor or your pharmacist or both will have that conversation with you about when you're taking your medication and when you're able to drive. We know most people take their medication at night, and it's often to help with sleep. So of course they're going to be less likely to be impaired when they wake up in the morning compared to someone who is suffering from insomnia. But that point of prescription is something that we'll use in a terminology space, which indicates that your doctor is prescribing you and your doctor is having that conversation. And it's what happens with every other medicine. So just bringing it back to, this is an issue of discrimination, and as David said, it's about prohibition, really. And the best way forward is to treat this like every other medicine and making sure that people are informed. Also, we know with doctors who are prescribing to new patients is that they give them a deadline or a time frame of, you know, ease your way into it. Take your medication for a week or 10 days and then your body will settle and you'll be able to then know how it interacts with your body and regulate yourself. There's also a point of prescription tool that is being developed by sort of road safety authorities as well as doctors that is a stylised guide of how to provide clients that information. We've also said we should restrict it to people who are excluded are P-platers and those with commercial licences. We don't want to have any risks with young people, but we also, or inexperienced drivers, but we also don't want any risk with commercial operators, so someone driving a truck for work. Another thing we thought was really important is that we know that alcohol and cannabis interact and that can heighten levels of impairment. So we've also put forward that you should have a 0 blood alcohol limit for a medical defence. And then patient reporting tools. So patients will work with their doctors and just have like an online form that they'll complete once a month, just so that there's data being collected on the fact that they know that they're safe to drive and there's that level of communication with their doctor. So currently, and you were talking about timeframes, it's really hard for us to be able to provide a timeframe because it's now sort of in that process with government of this is what we've proposed, these are all the arguments, and we know that the Premier is incredibly supportive of having reform here because Victoria was the first to legalise medicinal cannabis. It's a big industry in Victoria and it's an industry that is stalled because of the driving laws. And we know that every month more and more people are receiving a doctor's certificate and a script to access cannabis. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the research? I think we should probably just open up for questions.
What's the numbers of prescriptions at the moment? Active?
Well, I think March figure was about 5,500 new scripts.
Yeah, monthly.
Well, actually, it's a big subject because people are now obviously getting scripts from interstate and stuff like that. So it's hard to, it's somewhere around 75,000 people. But it's, if you look at the graph, it's going exponentially. And I mean, I think there's another element to medicinal cannabis, which is this whole thing of, is it actually a way of effectively decriminalising? This is one of the things that really keeps a lot of the conservatives awake at night. You know, is medicinal cannabis decriminalisation by medical stealth? And in part it is. In part it is, yeah. But the fact it is still medically prescribed, and because why? Well, cannabis actually is really good for treating a range of conditions, rather than using your benzodiazepines or your whatever else, yeah? So there is this element, and I was watching a program the other day that was really interesting. It was on the prohibition in America in the 1920s. You know, when they prohibited alcohol. And of course, it went on for about 10 years. In Victoria, we're only up to our 95th year of prohibition, but after about 10 years, it was starting to become a joke. And it was to the point where in America in 1928, there was 60 million prescriptions for medicinal alcohol. Yeah. And so I think that's sort of where people see it. And again, that brings us back to the whole question about this is not a medical debate, this is a prohibition debate, and we just need to bang it on the head. The other one I'd just make briefly is that this is a tactical issue for us. We haven't been in there that long. We're still trying to figure out how hard or how easy is this government going to work, you know? Are we going to have to be really nasty, vicious bastards, you know? Or can we work collaboratively with the government, recognising things will go a lot quicker and a lot easier if we can work collaboratively. And in that sense, it's really clear that there's a strong case you can build around this bit of reform. And our view, I think, is that if we can't get this up, then it's going to be a hard rain. You know, it's going to be a long, hard fight with the government for anything like mainstream decriminalisation or legalisation. This is an easy one for them to agree to. They appear to be doing that, and that's a nice thing, but truth will tell over the next few months. Sorry, that was a long answer to a good question.
Good answer.
Yeah, prohibition's prohibitionists have been using this carnage on the road excuse for decades, right? So that's obviously not changed. I guess you're obviously focused on medicinal use, and I understand why from a tactical point of view. But we want to be careful not to paint ourselves into a corner there saying it's, the only reason you should be driving with some THC is because it's medicinal use, because that's bullshit. There's no impairment there whether you've smoked it for fun or smoked it for medicine.
Yeah, exactly. There's no
And we need to be a bit careful about that. So I'm interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, look, I think your point, well, I probably should use this one. Can people hear me all right? Yeah, okay.
Actually, could you tone it down?
Look, your point's really well made, and I think that there is that danger. But it is a case from us when the tactical is really important. We're there for 4 years, and a lot of this stuff's going to be really hard to get through. Like it's really, for us, it was a piece of piss to put 6 top points on how to vote. Now, when you're actually in there and you're trying to figure out how to write the laws and how to get 21 out of 40 people to vote for it, it's a whole different sort of degree of difficulty. So that's part of why the tactical is about a much bigger issue. The other one is an equity issue, and striking to medicinal cannabis. Medicinal cannabis, at the end of the day, is rich person's cannabis, isn't it? It's fantastic. You got a script, you can get really good gear, and you can get it for a range of conditions. But if you're not wealthy enough to be able to afford it, let's face it, medicinal cannabis is very fucking expensive.
Settling weed $6.50 a gram.
That sort of thing, is it? Okay. So that's a second issue. So we're cognizant not simply on the tactical, but also that there's an equity issue about people being able to self-medicate. But let's win the med-can argument first. That comes second as part of the broader legalisation agenda.
Yeah, I'd just be keen to see it focused on there is no impairment.
Yes.
And then it does apply to everyone.
What we've found is when we start talking about impairment, there's like, how long is a piece of string? So that's where that's an even harder argument we're finding. And because in Tasmania there is actually, you as a medicinal cannabis patient, you are provided that medical defence. So, and it was by accident that the Tassies did this. They had legislation that was, if you are prescribed medicine, then you are provided a medical defence as long as you're not impaired. So when medicinal cannabis became prescribed, it just fell under that same clause within the legislation. Now, the Tassie legislation, we've seen that there has been no change in the road safety tolls and no change in any arrest rates based on that medical defence. It doesn't even show up on our radars when we try and investigate how many, what happened. Well, hardly
The same as you said in Canada,
Yeah.
the same, everywhere else is the same. It's just not an issue.
And what we find with we've really delved into the Canadian legislation as well, and that's come back with really positive outcomes. But particularly the police will say to us here is that, well, cannabis isn't legal. It's only legal if you're prescribed. So that's where that argument, I totally agree with you, but that argument is just, it's not about impairment. They just want to arrest. Yeah.
Just maybe two interesting comments. The police prosecutor, and I don't know which court trial, but I did Google it and find it out. And before I tell you what it was, they've agreed on this. You can actually buy THC saliva testing kits now, and they go down to 12 nanograms. Now, as far as I'm aware, your first swipe is 10 nanograms. If anyone's concerned about that today, come ask me, I'll give you a swipe. But the point is this. If you take THC in a capsule, and this is where the police prosecutors have agreed on this, and there is research to confirm this through saliva testing, and that's first-hand knowledge by myself being involved in the studies. You will be cannabis-free from a saliva point of view. So the point being is that the police are merely being vexatious, malicious or politically biased in their assessments on the road. It's only for people that vape, smoke or have THC on their tongues. But if you take a capsule of massive doses, total green out, I'm unconscious dose, 4 hours later I'm still buzzing in space, I will have clear saliva because THC does not go from the blood to the saliva. That's a fact, it's a lipid soluble. And the only time that that experiment model fails is if you have reflux, vomit, or bad gums with blood. So that was that point, which I think is worth in your arguments to include.
We're actually, I mean, all of the evidence that we've been talking to people from Swinburne and a couple of the other institutes that have done a lot of research, and it's very clear that there is no correlation between the amount of THC in your system, or very little other than at high levels. There's little or no correlation between presence of cannabis and degree of impairment. So, it's not like you can do a 0.05 alcohol. It simply doesn't work right. And that sort of cuts for us and it sort of cuts against us. But what I think our approach is in the legislation and in the debates we're having with the government is to say, this is not testing for impairment. You can test, street, roadside, touch your nose down on 1 foot, whatever. That's easy to do, but you don't do it. But this is not about policing. This is about health. And we have to keep it on the health and the medical, and it's about your relationship with your doctor and what your doctor advises you about the conditions under which you would take that medication and then operate machinery, including vehicles. Because as soon as we get into the swamp around measuring assessment, measuring blood levels, I think that's when we're going to die.
But I guess my statement just shows the silliness that they're only after the Cookie Monster and the one that rolls the joint.
Yes.
And in fact, in terms of analysing, I don't know why the police, and I wish you would push for this. I don't think we should be doing saliva tests. I think we should do hair clippings on everybody, because at least you can get a 9-month analysis of whether you've had cannabis in your system for 9 months. Then you can be safe to drive.
Well, Rachel mentioned Canada, and there's a lot of interesting data there, but you all know the Mounties? Yeah, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police. It's like equivalent of the Federal Police, but they have a lot on the ground. They have what they call the standard field impairment test, which is a walk the line, that sort of stuff. But in Canada, it's exactly the opposite of what they do here. In Canada, if you get pulled over, they do the impairment test first, the field test, and only if you fail the impairment test do they then swab you. Whereas here, it's like the swab factory, isn't it? Get them queued up, and each one's like, there's your license and $500. Oh, there's your license and $500. And so it's just, it's a policing, good revenue raiser, good way of establishing their presence, but it has nothing to do with your safety to drive.
Yeah, hi. I want to I came in a bit late, so I actually caught the very tail end of this, so apologies if I go over something you said. Now, I heard you talk about zero THC in the workplace with driving vehicles. Now, I'm qualified workplace health and safety, and medical cannabis is inevitable, and if you can get the unions on side, then you're going to go a long way to being able to get a Labor government to sort of get you through. Now, a union started health and safety, but also the New South Wales Electricians Union in about maybe 8-9 years ago now, they actually voted that anyone's cannabis use, regardless if it's medical or recreational, had nothing to do with that. So their union actually defended cannabis use already. So there's no reason why the unions cannot support it. Now, secondarily, research I know about alcohol or cannabis and driving is if you are impaired by cannabis, and a lot of people who, once you get used to the side effects, if you want to use that term, are no longer impaired. And like I said, 0.1% alcohol, something crazy like that. Now, my concern is if we start demonising cannabis even in the workplace, then that's going to be detrimental. But I also see if you can get that side of the Victorian Parliament moving, especially the unions, and protecting their workers, like a lot of people in unions like Transport CMFEU, they are going to be using medical cannabis and selling the packs, and they're operating forklifts and all kinds of ones in agreement, and there's nothing right now protecting them. And that may well be a backdoor way into it as well that hasn't really been explored, I think.
Yeah, totally, Stuart, and totally agree with you. And sort of the workplace testing is something that's next on our agenda, actually. So you've hit the nail on the head. I think for us, what we're proposing in the trial is a 0 blood alcohol limit. and that if you are a provisional license holder, so an inexperienced driver, like a P-plater, or if you have a commercial license, the reason we've sort of proposed that in the trial is because it's just that, it will just be a trial, so they want a considered number of people. I think what we will see though is once that trial is completed, it will then be reviewed as to commercial license holders. We don't want the fear of people thinking that they are going to be okay with workplace testing if they're okay with their medicinal cannabis testing when it comes to just their ability to drive generally, because they are two separate sort of pieces of legislation, two separate rule sets. So.
But they do intertwine when you're driving.
Definitely, yeah, exactly, and that's the irony of it all, isn't it? It's just ridiculous.
Professional drivers.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're hearing too is, I mean, we've even had a police officer talk to us who was fired from the police force for consuming their medicinal cannabis, a workplace test. They went to their police union. What they found as well was they got their test results which showed a certain level of THC, but they were only taking a CBD prescription medication. So they were surprised to see that. And
Still up, it happens.
completely, it is, definitely. Funniest thing about that is though, is that's the same medication that's about to be over the counter in chemists. So we're going to see more and more people coming up with roadside testing with a positive result. Now this police officer ended up going to their union. The union stood up for them and fought this case, and they have been reinstated as a police officer. But they didn't even have that level of knowledge to understand how that script would work, and they didn't even realise that there wouldn't be a medical defence for them because it is a prescribed medication. Now this person is taking medication, cannabis medication, because they used to be on opioid-based medication and it was causing them all sorts of trouble. Interestingly, they could have stayed on their opioid-based medication and not had any troubles. Yeah.
So has the officer been let to continue with their cannabis medication as well?
I believe so.
Now, is safe work or medic work cover Payne for it?
Good question. Do you want to talk a bit more about the union stuff?
Yeah, so we're talking to a number of the unions at the moment, because different unions, and particularly the stronger unions, have got different workplace agreements. But what we want to do is basically set up an inquiry to the whole question of workplace drug testing and what's the approach to it. And again, it's going to inevitably run around questions of impairment, occupational health and safety. But clearly there are huge anomalies. There are some unions that have been effective in they're saying, no, we're not going to have workplace-based testing, including the firefighters. There are other unions that are sort of concerned that if we open an inquiry, it could be a Pandora's box. So we're just working our way through that. But again, we see this as part of that strategy of normalising by bringing cannabis reform into lots of different parts of people's lives and forcing discussion and argument in different settings. So we were really encouraged, I think 2 weeks ago, the AMWU, which is one of the largest unions in Victoria, and certainly the most influential, did a Facebook survey of its members, which was, is cannabis an industrial issue and is workplace testing of cannabis an industrial issue? Specifically to gauge that support from their members. They've got that support, so now that's bringing some major left unions on board, and they will obviously be really valuable allies to you, as I think you're alluding to.
Yeah, they are. They're the back door. They actually really are. If all the Labor governments across Australia, they really are where, as a party and as a movement, we should be really leaning on the unions. Like, that's where we can really shorten this out, because the way we're going about it is a long race, and I mean, we will win. It's a long race, and I think we can cut it shorter by actually beating them at their own game. Using the unions against the Labor Party is actually, it's not to create a division, because I mean, you'll find that there's a lot of members in the Labor Party already who quietly support it, or have family members that use it already. And very quickly back to CBD. I know a person that was using my CBD that was legally tested at 0.3% THC, and they tested positive. And that's when we came to the conclusion of that. Now, also, just very quickly, when you do take CBD or THC and it's not in a carrier oil, so if it's in like a honey or any water distilled or anything like that, or an edible, it will still come up with the THC saliva test because it has not, when it's broken, the THC is in a carrier oil, it gets broken down outside your stomach. CBD, literally on an empty stomach, CBD will turn 4 out of 5 parts into THC. So every individual is literally, they can be diagnosed, given CBD, and they could actually take that, think it's a CBD effect, and it actually could be a stomach break and turn it into THC. So there's we won't really see any CBD products on the shelf for a while. Not legally. Sorry, but that was more of a statement.
Yeah, all right. So are there any other questions, comments?
Following up on what Stuart said, I hope you're chasing the rail unions as well.
Yeah, so we've actually got a meeting, I think, in 2 weeks with the Labor Council, with the Secretary of the Labor Council and some of the health and safety people. We'll be pursuing
From that
that.
industry, they're really pushing for saliva testing, just to try and get closer to the them basically. And having talked to one of the drug testers in New South Wales, the drug testing saliva test they use, terribly consistent outputs. So if they can end up, that's the regulator, uses a particular swab. If we get everyone that, then it becomes more independent based about urine testing. So then you go back into that 2, 3, 4 week zone.
Another question. How's your relationship or what's happening in other states, particularly like New South Wales, Queensland, where we're living up here? How's the future looking like? Partnerships or broken models? How's it doing?
Well, and the amazing thing about just having this recent election in New South Wales is that legalised cannabis got Jeremy Buckingham elected, so definitely got some movement happening there. And much like the position David and I are in, on the crossbench, they need our vote. So that it will be the same with Jeremy, and I dare say it will be a mirror. They will be considering what we have done so far and what inroads we have been able to make with our approach, and following a similar proposal, I would say. I do know that roadside, there was legislation introduced by Kate Fairman from the Greens in New South Wales, was it about 12 months ago now?
A bit less than 12 months,
And that was unsuccessful, but it may have been because of the government of the day, I would say. So now that there is a new government, they are much more open to conversations about, you know, I've heard a few of them talking about pill testing, I've heard a few of them talking about decriminalisation of cannabis and other drugs. I've heard them talking about roadside testing as well. So I couldn't give you an answer definitively on that, but I think that it will be on the radar very, very quickly in New South Wales.
And do you know anything on Queensland?
No, they have changed the laws around decriminalisation of small possession of drugs, but nothing to do with the road laws, no. Yeah. Hello.
I mentioned to you yesterday the targeting of the testing for driving it's not random.
Not at all.
It's clearly not.
Yeah.
And you see them all around here.
Yes.
No.
No.
Yeah. And I was asking yesterday about the data, and you just mentioned before as well, there's some clearly shit science coming out of Monash, and that's actually, again, another one I've seen happening for decades, that they test the bodies, and they've got some cannabis in it. There was cannabis. They were also 0.4 alcohol content.
That's right.
The cannabis that killed them. Right? And they've been doing that forever. Is there any, is there anything you can do now that you're in Parliament, I guess, to get access to better data or to push them to create better data? There's some FOI requests to find out where they're doing the testing, those sorts of things like that. It'd be interesting to see some of that.
Yeah, and I think David mentioned earlier there was at Swinburne University, we have Tom Arkell there, Dr. Tom Arkell, who is a leading researcher in this space. And you know, off the record, we've heard of how ineffective these tests are from his research about what the police are using. Now, the Premier said to us that we were entitled to see the reports that they were using to back evidence for their current status on driving laws. And then when they provided the report, particularly the one around roadside testing and the police use of those tests, about 3/4 of it was redacted. So they don't want us to see what's in that report, clearly.
a reason for that.
Yeah.
Wasn't just some psycho with a texter.
Yeah.
So we'll pursue that, but at the moment it's sort of like, okay, we'll come back, we'll circle round. Let's actually, you know, they want to give that to us, we know it's shit. They're obviously eyeing something. We'll come back to that. The main game at the moment is processing this specific piece of legislation, and then we'll pick at that scab a little bit later. Yeah.
Does Victoria use the same drag swabs that they use in New South Wales?
I think that, look, again, I wouldn't die in a ditch on this one. I think the drag is the secondary test.
It's a
and
drag
then the
swab.
first-
System there.
Yeah, so when you do your first test, it's a I can't remember.
It's
the
a
name.
drag.
It's a drag up. It goes into their drag out machine to do the initial analysis. And then they send it off to the
I think
lab.
it's the same.
The swab test that they use, that's Andrew from the embassy about 6 years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago maybe now. He tracked back that the company that makes the swab test is owned by the West End.
It's
So there's superannuation, that's part of superannuation.
Dragon do the marketing, they're not the manufacturers. And I've heard this, I can't actually track it down,
I
but
don't know, I was
there
going to
are
ask you, can you
three
find out
former
the
senior
score?
police officers
Yeah,
who
just say
have a majority
there's
share
four
of their
former
company.
police officers that kicked it off. But I was actually talking to a guy during the election campaign in New South Wales who was a high patrol guy. And he said that the results are so inconsistent in terms of you'll have somebody like go, had a joint last night, and they'll come up negative,
Yep.
and then somebody who's a medicinal user hasn't had anything for
Yep.
a week and a half, can't really trace. So it's even confusing the police
Yeah.
based on the information they're getting off the drive.
Yep.
As to, now we've got an expectation of what's going to come up, but it doesn't come up.
Yep.
So is that about solubility, is it about the mouth, is it about what? But the fact that the police themselves don't have confidence in the test.
Yeah. But again, you know that concept of like shitting in your own nest. So for us at the moment, we're trying to start a process. We want to focus it on health. We don't want to die in a swamp arguing over the technicalities of testing or whatever. That's a whole other issue, and it's not going away. It's still on the shelf. We're going to come back to it. But let's not allow ourselves to end up in long, detailed technical arguments that don't actually advance our cause, which is getting medicinal cannabis treated as a medicine.
I've even had one of my constituents pulled over for a test. He said, oh, I'm a medicinal cannabis patient, did the test, came back negative, but because he made a disclosure that he consumed medicinal cannabis, they arrested him anyway.
No, right.
Did you do the secondary test?
He did.
Did he
Yeah.
pass it?
Maybe not. Maybe it was the secondary test that got
Because
him. No.
first time I got done,
He got his license back, but he had to go through court to do that. Yeah.
first time I got done in 2010, coming into the bar and making this test, I actually told him that I'd smoked on the Saturday night because my son had just been born, and this is like Sunday night. And I passed the swab test, but because I gave him that, they took me to the bus. I passed the secondary. I drove off, drove into Byron and did what I had to do in town, then went home. And then 3 months later I got a letter in the mail telling me I had to go to court and lost my license for 6 months.
Just the lab.
It's in the disclosure.
So yeah, I'd strongly recommend anyone who don't disclose unless you test positive.
My cousin actually got done at a roadside, tested negative. He actually sucked the crystals out. And because they suspected that, they took him down to the police station and he tested negative again anyway.
Yes.
And he was baked.
I've got a question. As you know, I do a lot of work in Victoria too, and we've been talking with the police union, among other people, and looking at some of their policy papers and whatnot. And one of theirs was from just prior to the election, and they explicitly talk about cannabis law reform. So this is away from the medical, but incorporating adult use or recreational use. And their position is that there should be no reform until there's an impairment test. Now, I know people who have taken that and said, well, God, we just need to play on their terms. We've just got to find ways to fund the development of an effective impairment test. My caution about that is that they're perhaps not being genuine. And in addition to that, not just devious, but I think there's all sorts of things going on, like there's a whole lot of trauma within police around road fatalities that mean that I don't think they actually engage with that issue in the most rational way, and that's no criticism, like it's a shit thing to do to have to show up to road fatalities, no doubt. But I'm just curious about what your observation is about how to kind of engage with that impairment issue in those conversations about reform of non-medical cannabis.
I mean, the Victoria Police do have a standard field impairment test. And I think the last data we looked at, there was something like 800 police officers who've been through the training program. So, in that, and that's not a lot, you know. So that tells you a bit about VicPol Command's priorities, which is not a priority, and that's reflected in the prosecutions. And so, I think in some ways you're right. I mean, this is a touchstone issue for the cops, and in part it's from their personal experience. But it's very clear that in terms of when we're lining up the pieces to work out who's going to be working with us and who's in it, the police are default setting no change, and they are applying a lot of pressure on the government to not agree to what we want. And I think it's to the point where even the progressive voices within the police force don't want to put their heads above the floorboard because they know that if they say anything positive, they're going to get their heads kicked in. So we will need to work on that relationship, obviously, and we intend to, but at the moment, you know, we want to get this done, we want to get this done now, and to the police it's basically, look, you know, happy to work with you, but if not, get out of the way.
And I agree with you, Will. I suspect that the police saying we will accept this when there is testing to measure impairment is a bit of a red herring on their part. It's something that they're offering that isn't even an option as yet. We do know that in Canada, I think it is, and in the US, there is retina scanning technology that is starting to evolve into measuring impairment. But again, it's quite a few years off. And our argument here is very much you're criminalising people for accessing their medicine. We are seeing more and more people accessing cannabis as medicine, and that's just going to continue. That trajectory will continue to be elevated. So we don't want to continue to see people criminalised for just accessing another form of medication.
Or not accessing the course of the driving.
Yeah, and we know that roughly, from what the doctors that we've spoken to, roughly 20% of their patients are too shit scared to take their medicine and revert back to more harmful medicines because they are worried about the driving laws.
The amount of people I know that stopped using medical cannabis or cannabis in this region because they're 65 and losing their license.
That's right.
And yeah, it's not right. You should not have to sacrifice the medicine for the right to be able to transport yourself. Now, as someone who lives around here, who's physically disabled, I've just come off 12 months loss of license and for a swab test. And it's very hard to get around. Like, I'm autistic, so if I get on a bus, I have a sensory overload, so I basically almost chuck my guts up. So, comparatively to say in Sydney or Melbourne or any other capital city, being in regional parts of Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, whatever, we are so much more disadvantaged. I mean, there's no public transport on a Sunday around here. I mean, there's a little bit in Byron Bay because it's Byron Bay, but I mean, elsewhere there's very little. And it's very hard. If you can't get around, it really can screw you up, and there's got to be some kind of protection for that, because when you talk, another thing I think about a lot is mental health. Now, you said health just a few minutes ago, and that's a key word for me, with health and safety. Now, every other person, there's part of the health and safety legislation that says other persons, which is the general public. Now, you have to, as an employer, ensure the health and safety of another person. Now, I've had to pull over probably maybe 50, 100 times because Lyndon NB28, the local cop car, comes flying up behind on its way to Lismore, on its way back out here doing 100 whatever in an 80k zone. Comes up behind me and I have to pull over because I have a panic attack because of how much it's fucked me up in the past now. Now, that's my mental health. And I'm driving and operating a vehicle and my mental health's been put in compromised, and I feel more unsafe when there's a cop car behind me than I do at any other time while I'm driving on the road. And I mean, if we're going to talk about health and mental health, they have the duty of care to ensure our health and safety, and by creating a state of paranoia and anxiety, they're actually compromising our mental health. And I actually think that this needs to be sort of like put to the challenge, and you guys may be in the right position to do it.
No, I agree with you.
And I hope this can.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Really do.
That might be a good note.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Bob.